Good evening. In Chapter 1, we discussed the fact that we have an impending crisis as a result of the exploding growth of human beings on this planet and the limited number of resources which the planet can provide. And if we are to avoid extinction as a species, we need to either increase the amount of resources that the world can provide to us or to decrease or at least level off the number of human beings that we're producing that consume those resources. For the last several chapters, we focused on how the world produces resources through a mechanism known as the ecosystem. We've studied how ecosystems form, what they do, and how they evolve. For the next couple of chapters, we're going to focus on the human problem. That is, what are the strains that our burgeoning population increase is putting on the earth, and what are some of the alternatives in terms of what we can do to address the exploding human population. Here we see the graph that we saw in Chapter 1, which shows the rate of human population growth from ancient times through the present and projected somewhat into the future. One of the things that we note is that up until relatively recently, the rate of human population growth was relatively modest. And this is because of the fact that man was literally dying almost as fast as he was reproducing. And the reason he was dying was because of what we studied in another chapter, namely environmental resistance. The environmental resistance factors that man dealt with back then were such things as famine, if he couldn't find food or if he wasn't able to hunt. Weather, if he wasn't able to protect himself against the elements. Disease, such as the Black Plague, which made a significant dent in man's population back in the early 13 and 1400s. These things all contributed to moderating and keeping man's population numbers relatively low. But then man went through a number of what we now call revolutions that better prepared him to survive. One of these revolutions was the Neolithic Revolution, during which man learned how to both grow crops and domesticate animals for food. This is important because it helped to alleviate him from concern or from famine that was brought on due to factors such as weather. It allowed him to grow crops and set them aside, to raise animals and butcher them so that he had food to get him through the lean times and assure his survival. Later, in the 1800s, man went through something called the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, he was able to build machines that helped protect him from the elements, that also helped relieve him from a lot of the work that literally caused him to work himself into an early grave. And as a result of the Industrial Revolution, he was better able to combat the elements. Then, very importantly, towards the end of the 1800s, was the Medical Revolution. The Medical Revolution helped him to literally fight his only really main competitor and predator at that time, which was disease. With the Medical Revolution, he learned how to fight microbes, to fight parasites, to protect himself against the things that were responsible for a large majority of his deaths at that point in time. A couple of other revolutions have come since then that we will talk about in this and later chapters. But the main point is that as of the Medical Revolution, man had finally conquered his last major predator, and therefore man's population began to grow in a J-curve type of direction. He literally doubled his numbers in less than 100 years, doubled them again, or increased them by 1 billion in less than 30 years, and it is by 2012, just this past year, man survived the 7 billion mark. At the rate that he's going right now, we're hoping that the human population will begin to level off around the end of the next century at about 10 billion. However, this population growth that we are going through right now is putting a tremendous strain on the Earth's resources. And if we don't find ways to mitigate that strain and help prepare for the eventual numbers of people that will be born in the future, we will have a significant problem. Of course, the major question raised by the human population growth curve we just looked at is how many human beings can our planet support? Or in other words, What is the carrying capacity for human beings on our planet? And unfortunately, there is no clear-cut answer to that question because it really depends upon at what level of comfort are we willing to survive as a species on this planet. Already we see tremendous variations in terms of the relative wealth, prosperity, and quality of life between people in one part of the world and other parts of the world. For instance, this graph shows a rough um, classification of the world's countries based on their economic development. The green countries represent those that have relatively highly developed countries. They have a high standard of living, and the median income for the average person in these countries is about $37,000 a year. On the other hand, we have the dark brown countries, which represent the most poorly developed, economically deprived countries on our planet. The median income for people in these countries is less than $600 per year per person. A tremendous gulf between those two ranges. And of course, the gray countries represent those that are what we call middle income countries, those that are obviously in between the prosperous and the economically deprived. In addition to simply the difference in the wealth of these countries is the fact of how much of the wealth of the world these countries control. For instance, the developed countries in green, while they only represent about 15% of the world's population, in fact control 80% of the world's wealth, whereas the countries in dark brown represent almost 40% of the world's population and only 10% of the world's wealth. So obviously, when we ask the question of how many people can this world support, the question is largely determined by the opposite question of at what standard of living do you want to support them? However, it turns out that there's an even bigger question involved here besides the relative standard of living of people on the planet, and that is the observation that 80% of the world's current population increase is occurring in these poor developing countries, whereas in the developed wealthy nations, relatively little population increase is occurring beyond what we call the replacement level, that is, one person born for each one that dies. So therefore, it behooves the well-off countries to help the poor countries to become more developed, if for no other reason than to help them deal with the rate of population increase on our planet, which then of course benefits everybody. However, economic development, particularly in poor countries, often comes with a price, and unfortunately part of that price might be the deterioration or harm to that country's environment. And it does us little good to control our planet's population if at the same time we are destroying the very ecosystems that are necessary in order to feed that population. One of the major traps that occurs with countries attempting to develop quickly is the fact that they turn towards their natural resources as the most readily available source of income. And consequently, they very often, as we see in this accompanying photograph, will cut down wide swaths of valuable forest and sell them off for the lumber, or even worse, just burn them down in order to clear land to be used for farming. This wholesale destruction of environment, while on the short term may help a country to develop economically, will, in the long term, cause overall damage to its ability to sustain its ability to produce wealth through its ecosystems, not to mention to its impact on the world as a whole and its ability to moderate its conditions and to control worldwide problems such as global warming. So, is there anything that we can say about future populations? Well, actually, there are a few things that we can predict. But again, we have to separate those predictions into those occurring in developed countries versus those occurring in developing countries. What we see here is what we call a population profile for a developed country. It indicates the numbers of individuals on the bottom versus their ages in 5-year increments. What we see is that the majority of individuals in developed countries are in the 20 to 50-year age group back in 2005. And we see that the population of these developed countries continued to increase up until just about 40 years ago. At that point, the population of these countries began to fall off, as represented by fewer and fewer numbers of individuals in the younger age categories. This is because this was the time at which contraceptives were invented, and those developed countries that had access to contraceptives began using them. If we look at the population profile for developed countries in the future by 20 years, again, we see the largest portion of the population has moved up about 20 years in terms of age distribution. We continue to see the fall off in terms of children being born, but more significantly, we see a larger number of individuals in the upper age groups. These are the people who are going to be tapping more and more of our Social Security and Medicaid resources, and as you probably are aware, these sources in the United States are already being challenged and will prove to be a real crisis in the future. If we compare the situation with that in developing countries, we see a population profile that looks like this, distinctly different from the one in developed countries. What we see is that there is a continuing increase in the number of individuals being born. There's no drop off in terms of children being born, and that there is a drop off in terms of the elderly. So as opposed to developed nations where there are fewer children and more older generations, in developing countries there are more children and fewer elderly. And this situation is unlikely to change in the future. As we see here, the only difference is the numbers of people in each category. So why is uncontrolled population growth such a problem in developing countries as opposed to developed countries? Well, there are a number of reasons for this that we'll go into in the next chapter, but one of them is what's portrayed on this particular graph, which refers to something called the demographic transition. What we see here is 4 different stages in the growth cycle, if you will, of a country or of a population, in this case humanity. We begin with what we call a primitive time, during which the birth rate of a population is almost offset by the death rate of a population. That is, as I said at the beginning of this chapter, people are dying almost as fast as they are being born. And the net population then is the difference between these two rates, which we see as relatively small. In the final phase of the development of a population, which we call here the modern era, you have both a low death rate and a low birth rate. Again, the difference between these two being relatively small and therefore allowing for a relatively small amount of population increase. The problem is in this transition between phase 1 and 4, in which we see that the death rate of a country falls much more quickly than its birth rate. And therefore, the difference between these two rates gives a very large rate of population growth. This is exactly the situation that has occurred in developing countries, in which the technology for reducing death rate was introduced into these countries very quickly as modern countries began to move into them, and the rate of the birth rate decline occurred much more slowly. So we see then that the problem of human overpopulation is a problem which primarily concerns developing countries. In the next chapter, we're going to see the surprisingly simple but not easy solution to that problem.